Portsmouth's most successful period as a football club goes back as far as the late 1940s. Back then, they won the English League trophy in back-to-back seasons, 1949 and 1950. Since then, there has been very little in the way of success for the club, bar a truly inspiring FA Cup win in 2008. For a club that has had fantastic footballers such as David James, Glenn Johnson, Sol Campbell, Tim Sherwood, and Teddy Sheringham on its books at various points, how did things get so bad? Let's go back to the events that succeeded the club's first foray into administration in 1998. New ownership. 5 months after Portsmouth went into administration, Milan Mandaric took over as club owner. He was known to be a very impatient man, and he often pulled the trigger on various managers without giving them enough time to perform. When Mandaric came in, he signed and sacked 3 managers in less than 3 years, including Tony Pulis, who went on to have an extraordinary career at Stoke City. Then, Harry Redknapp was brought in. Initially, his job was to be the director of football in charge of transfers, but that contract was later adjusted to make him Portsmouth's new manager during the 01-02 season. That year, Harry could only guide the team to 17th place, but his first full season was a stunner. The Redknapp era under Mandaric. Harry's first full season, the 02-03 season, was Mandaric's 4th as Pompey owner. He was starting to get restless with the club's lack of success on the pitch, and understandably reluctant to give Harry a lot of money to work with in the transfer window. However, as he'd had to do for most of his career, Harry made the best of what was available to him and signed some crucial players in that summer transfer window. Shaka Hislop, Paul Merton, and Tim Sherwood were all entering the latter years of their careers, and Harry convinced them to join the club in the Championship, then called Division 1, on free transfers. 20-year-old Nigerian striker Yakubu Aiyegbeni was also signed on loan from Maccabi Haifa in that first year, and he later signed permanently for €4.75 million. The 02-03 season ended with Portsmouth gaining promotion to the Premier League after winning the championship with 98 points from 46 games. To prepare the squad for the new challenge of the top-tier league, Harry once again dipped into the free transfer market with deals for the 37-year-old Teddy Sheringham and 29-year-old Patrick Berger. On paper, these deals were short-term, but they really helped to steady the ship at Pompey. They finished 13th in their first season back in the top tier, but in the 04-05 season, things started to fall apart. Harry and Mandaric had a bust-up following a decision to bring in Velimir Zayek as the director of football, and Harry walked out of the club in defiance. He was replaced by Alan Perrin, and Portsmouth's form dipped dramatically to the point where they barely escaped relegation back to Division 1. That terrible form persisted into the beginning of the 05-06 season, and Mandaric had to swallow his pride to bring Harry back to the club a year after he'd left. The Redknapp era under Gaidamak. In an unexpected turn of events, Mandaric sold Pompey to Alexandre Gaidamak, barely a month after Harry's return. News came to light that he'd mismanaged the club's finances and so taken the easiest way out when it looked like the house of cards would come crashing down on him. At that point, Portsmouth was owing various creditors up to £60 million. Gaidamak stood in as guarantor for those loans and went further to make funds available for Harry to invest in new players. It looked like the sun was coming back up at Fratton Park. The January transfer window opened up, and Harry immediately got to work bringing in a couple of players. Most notably, Pedro Mendes joined the club from Tottenham for an undisclosed fee, and Benjani joined from AJ Auxerre for a then club record of €6 million. Portsmouth barely escaped relegation that year, partly due to the poor start they'd had under Perrin before he was sacked. However, the new signings alongside those that joined in the next transfer window helped the club to a fantastic finish in the 06-07 Premier League season. In total, the club spent €9.1 million on new signings that year. This included deals for Nico Kransar from Hajduk Split for €5 million, David James from Manchester City for €1.7 million, a loan deal for Glenn Johnson from Chelsea, and free transfers for Sol Campbell from Arsenal and Nwankwo Kanu from West Bromwich Albion. Portsmouth's 9th place finish emboldened Gaidamak, and he invested even more in new signings the next year. €58.6 million was spent in the 07-08 season, as Harry was able to attract younger and hotter prospects to the club. Glenn Johnson's deal was first made permanent for €5.5 million, and deals for David Nugent, John Utoka, and Sully Muntari soon followed. The trio joined Pompey for €9 million, €10 million, and €10.5 million respectively. Jermaine Defoe and Lassana Diarra also joined the club in January for €9.3 million and €7 million respectively. At that point, Harry was spending a lot, and the wage budget rose pretty quickly. However, results on the pitch justified the spending as Portsmouth achieved their highest ever Premier League finish in 8th place. They also won the FA Cup, famously knocking Sir Alex Ferguson's Manchester United team out in the 6th round with a 1-0 win at Old Trafford. Sully Muntari's well-placed 78th minute penalty after Milan Baros had been fouled inside the box was enough to silence the 75,000 capacity stadium and send the Pompey faithful into rapturous delight. However, celebrations were short-lived. Following the stock market crash of 2008, Gaidamak had to pull funding from the club. Debts were now up to £68 million, and the only way out was to sell Portsmouth once again. A deal worth £70 million was shortly completed, and the club was sold to Suleiman Al Fahim, an Abu Dhabi property developer. Gaidamak only received £2 million, as the rest of the money was supposed to be used to clear the club's debt. To complete the misery for Pompey supporters, Harry Redknapp left the club to join Tottenham on October 26, 2008, and his assistant Tony Adams took over as caretaker manager. A mass exodus. Soon enough, the spending club soon became the selling club as Portsmouth let their best players go in a bid to raise some much-needed revenue. Lassana Diarra was sold to Real Madrid for €20 million, and Defoe left for Tottenham for €16.4 million. Muntari and Pedro Mendes also left the same year for €14 million and €3.75 million to Inter Milan and Rangers respectively. Newly appointed full-time manager Tony Adams had a difficult time maintaining the form of Harry's team as it got weaker and weaker as more players left. He was sacked in February 2009 after Portsmouth only picked up 10 points from 16 games, and was replaced by Paul Hart. Lies owners tell. Around this time, it was discovered that the new owner, Suleiman, was not the billionaire businessman that he'd claimed he was. In fact, he'd stolen £5 million from his wife to make the initial down payment on his purchase of Portsmouth. He was sent to prison for it, but not before he successfully completed a deal with Falcon Drone to sell the club. At the time, Falcon Drone was a business registered in the British Virgin Islands and financed by Ali Al Faraj. All good again? Not quite. it would appear that Portsmouth had in fact gone from frying pan to fire. Ali Al-Faraj was another liar and cheat, and it turned out he also wasn't as rich as he'd claimed. He'd purchased Portsmouth with a £70 million loan from Balram Chanry's Portpin Limited, and when he couldn't keep up with payments, he lost ownership of his company and Portsmouth to Balram. While all of this went on, Portsmouth continued to suffer in the transfer market and on the pitch. They sold more players every window and had more managerial changes. Avram Grant replaced Paul Hart in November 2009, but he couldn't save the club from relegation to the Championship. When Balram took control, he'd immediately put the club into administration in an attempt to refinance its £135 million debts. And that decision took a toll on Pompey's success on the pitch. They finished rock bottom of the league with a paltry 19 points from 38 games. The consequence of a 9-point penalty from the FA for going into administration. Incredibly, they still managed to get to the FA Cup final that year, beating Tottenham 2-0 after extra time in the semi-finals, before losing 1-0 to Chelsea in the final. However, UEFA stopped them from competing in the 10-11 Europa League despite qualifying as FA Cup runners-up. Again, it was a punishment for the financial situation at the club, and soon after, Portsmouth was sold once again. This time, it was to a Russian gangster, Vladimir Antonov. In their defense, Antonov's life as a Russian gangster did not come to light until a few months after he took ownership of the club. But it was yet another case of someone not doing due diligence on a background check before signing any papers. Antonov's business went bust after a continent-wide arrest warrant was served at his London office. Not long after, the HMRC turned up to Fratton Park with an unpaid £1.6 million tax bill. The club went to administration once again, this time with up to £160 million in debt. Unsurprisingly, Portsmouth was relegated to League One at the end of that season. They were owing staff and players up to 6 months' worth of salaries, and there was no indication of a way out. At that point, complete liquidation was a real possibility. A fan ownership proposal was tabled, and the Pompey Supporters Trust took ownership of the club ahead of the 2011-12 season. Pompey consequently exited administration, but the new ownership was taking over with the club's entire playing staff gone. They filled out the squad with academy players and, unsurprisingly, finished rock bottom of League One. For the first time in their history, Portsmouth was relegated to the 4th tier of English football, League Two. The dramatic fall from grace was complete. Final words. Portsmouth has since been declared debt-free, and they've also earned promotion from League Two. However, that timeline of a decade from their return to the Premier League to relegation to League Two saw the club go through more lows than many other clubs see in their entire existence. The FA Trophy might be a more realistic proposition than the FA Cup nowadays, but it's a nice thought to imagine Pompey being back in the big time again one day.